to start off with why we need such a thing in Wales, as you are no doubt aware, place names is something of a hot topic at the moment. You know, it seems that we can't go more than a month without a sort of a huge storm blowing up on social media because, you know, another historic Welsh place name has been replaced with something usually fairly crass in English. And just to give you a few examples of this kind of thing, the most famous example has to be Happy Donkey Hill, which is actually a farm just outside Llandysul in Ceredigion called Vaerdre Fach. Now, to give you an idea of the problem with this, Vaerdre Fach as a name goes back at least 500 years. And Maerdre is a manorial settlement, basically. So that gives you an idea of medieval land use. You know, it tells us something about the history of the place, the use of the land there. And as I say, it's at least 5 centuries old. Whereas Happy Donkey Hill, well, it's a donkey sanctuary, great. You know. We also have Plas Glyn Llifon, just outside Caernarfon, which was put on the market by its owners, and they decided that they would market it under the name Wimborne Hall, on the basis that, well, you know, if it has an English name, it'll sell better. Which, you know, is unfortunately a thing that estate agents seem to say when you go to sell your house. My sister-in-law sold a house recently, and she wanted to put it on the market with a Welsh name, and the estate agent said, no, you make sure it has an English name, because, you know, you'll get a much better price for it, which is bizarre, honestly. But this isn't just a thing that affects houses. Cwm Tiddy, for instance, you know, it's a village on the coast in Ceredigion, and Visit Wales were doing a thing where they were promoting the coastal path, and they basically got a young couple to walk all along the path and blog about what they saw and what they did on a day-to-day basis, which is a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, when they got to Cwm Tiddy, they sort of had a bit of a Google and thought, right, you know, what can we say about Cwm Tiddy? And they discovered a website made by a man from Birmingham who had once seen a seal in Cwm Tiddy, and as a result had decided to refer to the place on his website as Seals Bay. You know, having just completely made the name up. It's never been called Seals Bay at any other point in history. But of course, this was now on the internet, and it was on Visit Wales's blog. So the risk then is that the BBC gets hold of this and starts referring to, you know, when they're referring to Cwm Tiddy in an English language thing, they call it Seals Bay, which it isn't. Luckily, I you know, happened to be on Twitter at precisely the right time and was able to message Visit Wales and say, look, you know, stop. This is absolutely not an English name for Seals Bay, for Cwm Tiddy. This is just something that they've made up. Please, please, please don't use it. And so they, you know, they took it out. But this shows, you know, the risk we have. Once a thing is on the internet, you know, if it then gets used, oh, this is the English name for such and such a place, is it? Oh, right. You know, so this then becomes the tourist name. And then Ordnance Survey will decide, oh, well, this name is in common use, and so it'll start appearing on the maps, which is what's happened with Little Pudding Cottage down in the middle there. Little Pudding Cottage is actually called Pont Bryn Ddu, which as a name goes back at least 100 years. And as with all Welsh place names, it refers to something in the landscape. Right next to the house, there is a wooden bridge, footbridge type thing, which is the Pont Bryn, and it's black, D. But Pont Bryn Ddu is now a holiday cottage, and again, with the, you know, these things must appeal to tourists, and apparently tourists are terrified by the existence of the Welsh language or something. The name, it was decided to call it Little Pudding Cottage, which might actually be a worse name than Happy Donkey Hill. You know, we have all of these examples. There's you know, Slate Mountain, which is a activity centre out in Blaen y Festiniog. It's based in a quarry called Llechwedd, but again, tourist company running it decided that Llechwedd was too hard to say and would put tourists off from visiting, so they decided to change it to Slate Mountain. And massive outcry locally, the local MP and Senedd member got involved, and the company decided that, oh, we're okay, we understand strength of feeling locally, etc. So what they did is they put Slate Mountain into Google Translate and came out with Mynydd Llechi and said, well, give it a bilingual name. And people said, no, just call it by its actual name. It's in Wales, it has a Welsh name. This is a normal thing. Or Mountain Sea View, which I'm afraid to say is very local to me. This is a farm where the farmer decided to diversify a bit and put up a glamping site, which, great idea. The farm's called Bwlcheinion. It's in Cwm Einion, just a bit further beyond Blaen Einion, above the river Einion, because again, names are intimately linked into the landscape. But the farmer decided that tourists wouldn't go to a place called Bwlcheinion, so he thought, well, it's up a mountain and you can see the sea, so I'll call the site Mountain Sea View. Now, this sort of thing makes people very, very angry, and you can understand why. All of these names have history. They tell you about the landscape, they tell you about the heritage of the area. They're in Welsh, which obviously is the language of Wales and has been since the Romans left. These things are important, and it was obvious that something had to be done, and the something that was done was the Historic Environment Wales Act 2016. Now, amongst other things, this provided for the creation of a statutory list of historic place names, which would, one, collect lots and lots of place names, and two, give them a statutory legal existence. So what this means is, if you want to change the name of your house in Wales, you're supposed to write to your local authority, informing them of the change, and then they are supposed to write back to you with a sort of an information pack, if you like, explaining about the importance of Welsh history, Welsh heritage, the Welsh language, and they ask you very nicely to think again. Then you have a cooling off period of 10 days, and then at the end of that, if you want to go ahead with the change, well, it's your house, so you can. But the old name at that point comes into the list of historic place names. So even if the plaque on the house is different, the old name will be remembered and it won't be lost. And of course, this isn't just a good cultural thing for us now. In 100 years, the descendants of people who lived in the house when it had a Welsh name will be able to find it, even though it's now got an English name. So how successful are we being at this? Well, we don't have data yet from all of the local authorities, unfortunately. Although, interestingly, having talked a lot about how we're losing Welsh names and they're being replaced by English names, the data we do have suggests that actually it's the other way around. If you look at Powys down the bottom there, 2017 to 2019, 70 house names were changed, but most of them were changed from English to Welsh. Then if you look up the top at Ceredigion, they've had 10 English names changed to Welsh, as opposed to one Welsh name changed to English in 2020. And new names, that's houses being named for the first time, 230 were named in Welsh and only 11 were named in English. So is it just that we have these hideous headline cases like Happy Donkey Hill and Little Pudding Cottage, but actually on the ground is the shift the other way around? We're not really in a position to say at the moment, but I will more on that later, as they say. So that's and as you can see from in Anglesey, they've seen an improvement since the policy. So it seems fairly positive, but it's unclear at the moment. We seem to be having success, but we're not quite sure how much. But one place where we absolutely can see concrete success with this new policy is new estates. Now, as I said, the list is statutory, and part of that requires the Welsh government, local government, the archaeological trusts, Natural Resources Wales, and developers to take the names in the list into account when naming or renaming new streets, new developments, and things like that. And I'm very pleased to say that the local authorities have absolutely grasped this with both hands. And you know, whenever there's a new estate, for instance, there's a new estate going up in Penllyn, just outside Swansea, and the street naming and numbering officer for Swansea Council has emailed me, and basically I've named all the streets on the estate with historic names. You know, we've taken them from the fields that the estate is being built on, or, you know, old lanes or streams in the area, that kind of thing. So what this means is that, you know, even though you've got a brand new housing estate, the history of that place isn't being lost, you know, because the field names are appearing on the street signs. You know, this is kind of giving new life to historic names, making our heritage work. The 4 examples I've got here, by the way, the bottom left is in Fishguard, and the other 3 are various places in Caerphilly Borough. I forget quite where. I've had a lot of interest in this from Caerphilly Council. I mean, to the extent that I'm rather tempted to take a road trip down to Caerphilly and, you know, wander around the place going, oh, I named that one. I named that one. Anyway, so where does the name exist? Sorry, where does the list exist? Well, basically on the internet. So this is our website. It is fully bilingual, Welsh or English. You can flick between them at any point. We have a blog, which is updated, honestly, not as often as it should be, but ideally sort of once a month or so, where we sort of, you know, if we've got any news, you know, we've just put in this sort of interesting set of place names from this sources, you know, look, we've traced this house name right back to 1300, you know, that kind of thing. Those of you who understand Welsh will be able to tell that there's bad jokes as well. And then for those of you who don't speak Welsh, this is probably the most important part of the website, because this is our glossary. And what we have here is place name elements. So, you know, rather than a whole place name itself, we've got things like, you know, Bwlch and Biarth and Llan and Mawr and Bach and Llwyn and Bryn and that kind of thing. With a translation into English, so you can, you know, this is sort of the first step towards understanding what our place names mean, because the wonderful thing about Welsh place names is the Welsh language hasn't changed that much over the years. So 80% of place names are fully intelligible to the average Welsh speaker. You know, for instance, well, I live in Derwen Las. There used to be a big green oak tree here. You know, that kind of thing. You know, Llanbryn Mawr, well, the church, Our Lady on a hill. You know, that you can sort of spot them, go, instantly I know what that is, which of course isn't the same with English language place names. And the other thing that we're adding to this, hopefully very soon, is sound recordings. I'm about halfway through doing the actual recordings. We just need to upload them now. So, you know, next to each of these, you'll be able to click on the thing and hear the pronunciation of each of these elements. So hopefully that'll, you know, help non-Welsh speakers to be able to pronounce place names as well, because that's very important. And if you click on one of them, I've chosen Bwbach, which means a sort of a bogeyman or a goblin, basically because it's an excellent word. It will take you to a list of every single place name which contains the element Bwbach all across Wales. So as you can see, we've got All de Bwbach, the sort of steep wooded slope of the Goblin. We've got Bryn y Bwbach, you know, Goblin's Hill. We've got any amount of Cae Bwbachs, Cae Ffynnon Bwbach, rather there, you know, the field of the Goblin Well, rather like that one. And then if you click on map, it'll take you to a map of Wales with every single Bwbach place name marked on it. And then if you scroll, if you you know, zoom in and click on one of them, it'll take you right to the name. So this is Twll Bwbach, which means Goblin's Hole, which is quite wonderful. And it's a house just outside Dolgellau. And so this is the screen you'll see each time you click on an individual name on the list. And this is where we give you all the information that we have about the name. So for instance, it'll tell you that Twll Bwbach is a settlement name. And so it'll be, the dot will be blue. It gives you the grid reference, so you can find it on a map, go straight to it. It gives you the parish that it's in. These are the pre-1974 civil parishes. And it gives you the county, which is, again, the 13 historic counties. So obviously Twll Bwbach, for our purposes, is in Meirionnydd rather than in Gwynedd. It tells you when the name was recorded in this particular form. And that's quite important, and I'll touch on that later. You know, we're not just collecting names, we're collecting forms of names. It will also tell you the primary source we got it from, which in this case is the second edition Ordnance Survey map from circa 1900. And the secondary source, if there is one, which in this case is the GB 1900 project, which I'll talk about later. But, you know, secondary sources are things like crowdsourcing projects, or, you know, a book of the place names of insert area. It'll tell you if we know anything interesting about the name. You know, there's a sort of notes section. So, you know, how big is the website, and, you know, is anyone actually using it? And the answer is yes. Sorry, that it says 80,000 individual users this year, but it should be last year. My apologies. To give you a sort of a context for this, the Irish government has a similar-ish website, and in the first 10 years of its existence, 25,000 people visited it. And we, you know, we're averaging about 80,000 a year currently. So, you know, we win that one. Pity about the rugby. You can leave comments on the names, and you know, quite often, obviously, these are something, you know, what does this mean? And I try and get back in touch as soon as possible and give an explanation. Wonderfully, the public have sort of seized hold of this one as well. And what you quite often find, there's a farm in Carmarthenshire called Cwngwyneddi, for instance. And someone had written, oh, you know, my grandparents used to live here. I've always wondered what the name meant. And before I could write back and offer an etymology, someone else would, oh, well, you know, I live up the valley, you know, it means this. And yeah, then someone else would written, oh, that's fascinating. You know, my aunt lived in that sort of the next farm along, and she always told me that it meant this. And, you know, we're seeing sort of discussions in the comment section, which is, you know, rather nicer and healthier than it can be in other comment sections. And most important, oh, we've had 268 inquiries through the contact form. So, you know, these are larger things. You know, I'm looking for this particular house, you know, could you find it for me, please? You know, I've got a list of sort of old names from the parish I live in, you know, would you like it? That, you know, lengthier inquiries. And most importantly, we, as of this morning, have 694,366 names in the list. And we are adding to that all the time. They come from 1,262 different sources. And I'll now move on to talking about them for a little bit. And the first one is Cynefin. Now, as you'll be able to tell, this is Powys Castle, and this is the 1841 tithe map. And the Cynefin project was run out of the National Library, and basically it was a project to digitize and transcribe all of the tithe maps, and they, you know, digitize them and then put them online, stitch them all together electronically, and you have this absolutely beautiful map which just then covers all of Wales. Now, with the tithe maps, as you can see, each field has a number, and then there'd be a key to each map, and you'd be able to look at the number, and you would just write, and you'd find the name of the field, what type of field it was, who owned it, who rented it, how much it was worth to the tithe, and various other things. And that information is all online on places.wales, run out of the National Library. Please do check it out, it's wonderful. And basically from this we got 500,000 field names, which I mean, as you can see from looking at this map, you know, each dot is a name. So we've very nearly got at least one name for every single field in Wales. So, you know, if you're looking out of your window tomorrow morning and thinking, oh, I wonder what the name of the field next to my house is, we've almost certainly got it. Then the next largest source was GB 1900 that I mentioned earlier. So this is another crowdsourcing project based on digitizing maps, in this case the 1900 OS. And again, you know, map is digitized and then volunteers transcribed all the information on it. And we've got, I think, 150,000 place names from this source. So this is where we get things, well, as you can see from the map, things like, you know, street names, individual house names, names of streams, lakes, woods, that kind of thing. So those are our two biggest sources. But obviously those are quite modern, aren't they? You know, 1900 and 1841, and this is historic names. So when we were launched, we also received an ingest of data from the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth. And what they gave us was about 12,000 early forms of various names all across Wales. And these are generally medieval, or in some cases even earlier. You know, we've got two names from the 2nd century AD in Greek, because this is a very important point. You know, I've obviously talked about Welsh names and English names so far, but of course they're not the only languages that have been spoken in Wales. You know, obviously Latin was used here for a long time, Anglo-Norman after the Norman invasion, Anglo-Saxon for that matter. You know, in Flintshire, quite a lot of the place names are of Anglo-Saxon origin. Irish has been spoken here. Greek has been used here, if not as a community language. And of course, you know, other speakers of other languages have used Welsh place names and turned them into their language. So we've got names in Venetian, Genoese, Dutch, Breton, Portuguese. Those are mostly for coastal features because obviously they're for navigational aids for sailors. So we've got this sort of huge variety of things. You know, Latin names from, well, the picture, the text you can see here, that's from the Book of Llandav. You know, the Acts of the Welsh Princes, monastic charters, medieval histories, that kind of thing. And what that allows us to do is trace the development of names back through the centuries. So for instance, this is Welshpool. And if you look at the image in the middle there for a second, you'll see, you know, a box with a Trallwng and then Welshpool written in it. That is what we call a head name. And if you click on that, you'll see all of the individual variants of a particular name through the centuries. So head names are names of things like, you know, towns and cities and villages, cummuds, cantrevs, tithe districts, that kind of thing, rather than sort of house names or something. And obviously here we have the place name going back, you know, 900 years. And the earliest form we've got is rather wonderfully Adzallwg Llywelyn, which of course, that's just an archaic form of Trallwng, isn't it? Which is the modern Welsh name for Welshpool. So there we go. You know, that name is at least 900 years old. And it's interesting, you know, it's Trallwng Llywelyn in the early forms. I'm not quite sure which Llywelyn that is, whether it's, you know, Llywelyn Fawr or Llywelyn Ola. And of course, I mean, Welshpool is an interesting place now. It's where, you know, Welsh speakers and English speakers have looked at the same thing and, you know, named it in both languages. Because a Trallwng in Welsh it's an area of sort of damp, boggy ground which sucks water in, and of course it's Welsh pool. And as you can see, you know, the name Trallwng carries on through the 12th century, and then the first time we have La Pole, because of course it was pool before it was Welshpool, isn't it? Was 1197, and then you see, you know, variants of the two, you know, La Pola, La Pole, or just Pola on its own, all the way through down through the 13th century. La Pole Villa in 1286, you know, so that's going to be in those are, you know, the Pole variants there, they're going to be in Latin or Norman French. And then the Pool in 1568, that's, you know, it's clearly in English. And then the first time you get Welshpool is in 1699. And then rather interestingly, again in 1699 in Welsh, Tre y Llyn, which of course, you know, the town of the pool. So is that just, you know, a Welsh translation of the name? And, you know, why are they using that when obviously the 1699 names are all from the same source? So clearly they know the name Trallwng. So, you know, where does Tre y Llyn come from? Now, when the Royal Commission was founded, our original job was to basically create a huge list of absolutely everything of any kind of historical interest all across Wales, which, this being the Victorian, well, the Edwardian era, we did by producing sort of authoritative, very grand volumes on a county by county basis. And this carried on until we got to Glamorgan, which there's so much in that it takes up an entire shelf. And at that point, we decided that it was time to start using the internet instead. But in the first 5 volumes, which is Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire, Meirionydd, Denbighshire and Montgomeryshire, we also collected place name information. So this is a page from the Carmarthen inventory. And as you can see, you know, we recorded the name, and we also recorded an interesting piece of information about the name. So to give you 2 examples, from just outside Machynlleth, where the industrial estate is now, there's a big rock called Carreg Fasnach. And the reason it's called Carreg Fasnach is there was a plague, one of the plagues, and basically, you know, people were frightened to go into town to the market, so they held a market at Carreg Fasnach, you know, well, market stone basically, in the open air outside the town, where it was thought to be much healthier. And then next to Carreg Fasnach is Nanter Arian, the money stream, and it's called that because as a health measure, they would wash the money they'd made at the market in the local stream, so it became known as Nanter Arian. And we've got sort of little interesting putty bits like that for all of the names from the inventory. In some cases, the interesting bit of information we have is we don't know why this is called this. There's another good Montgomeryshire example of this is a farm called Maes y Gard, which of course means battlefield. And the interesting piece of information we have about Maes y Gard is that there is no evidence whatsoever that there was ever a battle on this site. So God knows why it's called that. Now, obviously, those are, again, modern place names. So we've seen, right, medieval names, quite modern names. So, you know, what do we do to fill the gaps, basically? You know, we've got this big early modern period gap. So one of the things we looked at was the list of parishes in Wales compiled in circa 1570 by a man called William Davies Llywelyn. He was a professional scribe, he was a poet, he was a physician as well, and he was a secret Catholic at a time when being Catholic was very, very much illegal. And one of the things he used to do was he used to travel around the country, ostensibly in his role as a physician, you know, gathering ingredients and dispensing cures and what have you. And he'd use that as an excuse to travel around the country and distribute Catholic texts that he'd copied. And then in 1570, he decided to use the network of contacts he'd built up doing that to create a list of every single parish in Wales. Not quite sure why. But of course, this is before there was anything like a standard form of the Welsh language. So what you've got is he was from Breconshire. So you've got people giving him the, you know, in this case, Anglesey versions of Anglesey place names, and him hearing them in sort of, and then writing them down in Breconshire Welsh. So there's some interesting dialectical things going on. And we also have a couple of interesting things, like, you know, when he got to the parts of Wales that were English speaking at this time, which is basically the Gower and southern Pembrokeshire, he didn't really know what to make of English language place names. I don't think he spoke English. So you have, in some cases, you have sort of Welsh, you know, English names rendered into Welsh phonetics. So instead of, you know, Yerbaston, you have Yerbaston, and instead of Harbranston, you have, you know, Herbranston, that kind of thing. And in other cases, he just made a name up. For instance, there's a village in South Pembrokeshire called Freystrop, which he names Freystad Gam. And Freystad is obviously an attempt to render English Frey, and strop apparently in English at the time was a step or a sort of a jump, so that's cam in Welsh. But he's the only, well, other than me, because I'm weird, you know, William Davitt Llewellyn was the only person in history, as far as we know, to ever refer to Freystrop as Freystad Gam. So these are the parishes in Wales in 1570 plotted on a map, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will realise that one of them isn't in fact in Wales. That's Llanfan Honwen, which is the Welsh name for Cherbury. And I'm not quite sure why that's in there, because there's only 2 parishes that aren't in Wales, which are included in the list. But of course, whole chunks of Western English, of Western England were Welsh speaking at this time. So, you know, why are these 2 in and the others aren't? Now, the next source we used was the Parochialia, which was compiled by a man called Edward Llwyd, who was one of these wonderful people who was around in the 18th century, who was interested in absolutely everything you can imagine. You know, he was a linguist, he was a antiquarian, he was a botanist, he invented Celtic studies as an academic discipline in his spare time, basically. And he was also curator of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And while he was working there, he decided he was going to write the natural history of Wales. So he drew up a huge questionnaire and sent it to every single vicar in the country. Now, unfortunately, they didn't all reply. And even more unfortunately, some of the correspondence has been lost. But sufficient of it survives that it was published in 3 volumes in Archaeology Cambrensis. And I've gone through every single one and pulled out all the place names, of which, unfortunately, there are only 130 in Montgomeryshire. Treveglois parish, for instance, that's been very well done. But that's the only kind of complete parish we've got for Montgomeryshire. Flintshire and Denbighshire are fantastic. We've got pretty much everything for there. But Montgomeryshire's not so good, unfortunately. We have also used community projects, such as this one, Percy Penfro, which was put together by the local Mentoriaeth, you know, the body responsible for promoting use of the Welsh language in a given area. And what they did is they got together all the farmers in northern Pembrokeshire, and basically they had to make maps like this, you know, effectively a second tithe map, and had them write down all of the names of their fields, because they thought, you know, it's a good way to get people together doing things in Welsh, and also Pembrokeshire Welsh is quite distinct, so they'd be able to you know, make a song and dance about, oh, isn't it interesting, all the, you know, strange forms we have in Pembrokeshire. And, you know, this is a fantastic idea. It went really well. And then once the project was finished, there it sat in a drawer in the offices of the Mentor Iaith, until I happened to be down in Crumich one day giving a talk. And at the end of the talk, a man rushed up to me and said, oh, I've got 1,700 field names sat in a drawer in my desk. Do you want them? Oh, fantastic, brilliant. Yes, please. All right. So he sent them into the office, and I was busy with the Archaeology, so there they sat in my drawer for a couple of months until I thought, well, this is ridiculous. And I contacted one of my old students from when I was a lecturer and said, do you want an exciting intern experience? And he said, oh, fantastic. I said, oh, you know, Welsh language workplace. Oh, brilliant. You know, exciting heritage sector opportunity. Fantastic. Count me in. I said, great. You know, can't pay you, I'm afraid. Anyway, bless her, she came anyway. And she went through each of the maps. And again, just like the tithe, you know, there was a key. And she went through and she put all the place names in. So, you know, in some parts of Pembrokeshire, we've got a name from 1841, and we've got a name from 2017 as well. We're also hoping to add in sort of academic place name studies as well, like this one, Place Names of Pembrokeshire by B.G. Charles. We're 1,500 odd names in, which, to give you an example of just how much information there is in this, that means we're up to page 45 of the first volume. So I mean, this one's going to keep us going probably until I retire, honestly. But obviously there are similar studies like this for a lot of areas of Wales, and we want to get those in as well. Now back to the medieval period. The medieval Welsh poetry, loads of it survives, and it's sort of divided into two collections. There's the poets of the princes, which is obviously the professional bards from before we lost our independence, and then the poets of the nobility, which is the professional bards after the conquest. And obviously, you know, when you're a professional bard in the Middle Ages, you know, your job is to sing the praises of the local lord. You know, isn't he good looking? Isn't he generous, particularly to the bards? Hint, hint. You know, he's absolutely terrifying in battle. You don't want to mess with him. You know, he's really lays on a really good feast. And, you know, isn't his house lovely? The man lives in a palace. And of course, to do this, you have to use a lot of place names. And these have been collected together by Professor Anne Parry-Owen, again of the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies. And I have just recently finished adding them all into the list. So this, we've done rather better in Montgomeryshire out of this one. There's 254 names in this. And just to give you a few examples of them, we've got, for instance, a very early name for Powys Castle, which is Castell Coch in Welsh. The earliest we've got it there is 1400. And then we've got, again, 1435, a name for Buttington, it's Talabont in Welsh. And then Strathmarcel Abbey, you've got, sorry, that should be 1110 to 1137. It's down as Ustrad, and then Ustrad Marchell in 1365. You know, Fordin goes back to the 12th century. And what's really fascinating as well is that obviously, you know, if you're writing a poem to a particular individual, you quite often name their specific house. And quite a lot of those houses are actually still houses today. You know, the name has continued into the 20th century. So, for instance, you know, Glan Severn Hall in Beru, well, there it is as Glan Havren, Severn in Welsh, in 1430. You know, or Mathrafal, which these days is a farmhouse in Castell Carenion, but that's the court of the kings of Powys. So there it is in 1155, and we're still using that name today. You know, you really can trace house names back, well, in this case, you know, 900 years. It's wonderful. Now, I've talked a lot about, you know, the vast numbers of names that we've got, and to give you an example of kind of just how deep the coverage is, you know, just in Welshpool parish alone, we've got 4,899 names. You know, we've got the name of every street, all of the farms around, the streams, hills, that kind of thing. You know, this, and of course, you know, all the field names. And this is fairly typical. You know, our coverage is similar in pretty much every parish, although there are unfortunately some gaps where we have less. But, you know, to give you an example, I live in Garreg, right over the other side of the county, and it's about 5 square miles. And most of it's mountain. You know, it's a tiny place, and yet we've still got more than 200 place names from that parish. You know, this is really an absolutely huge data set. Now, talking of field names, one absolutely wonderful thing about the list is the way that the Welsh public has embraced it, because I've had so many people sending me names in, you know, whether it's the name of their house or, you know, if they farm, the names of their fields. And of course, you know, if you have a map like this, you can plot each one. But also, you know, in some cases, you just get a list. And because of all the Cynefin names we've got, you know, if you know vaguely where it is, quite often you can still plot those, because quite a lot of the names haven't actually changed at all. So, for instance, the top left example there, that's Glanmerin Farm, which is basically just behind my house. And most of those names were there in 1840, although there are a few changed. And in some cases, you know, the name has stayed the same, but it's moved up a field. If you look down at the bottom there, Caigel and Ffrwyth Caercrydd have swapped, you know, which is interesting. And then on the bottom right, this is actually a school project from the 1970s. And what happened here is, yeah, the sort of schoolboy at the time decided that he'd go and ask the local farmers for the names of their fields. And, you know, duly did so, got sort of 70 odd names, took it to school, got high marks, took it home. There it sat in a drawer until, you know, 4 or 5 years ago now. And he got interested in place name adult. And he decided to go and look at the tithe maps. And what he found was that about 1 in 3 of the names was exactly the same. Sorry, 1 in 3 of the names had changed. Despite, and, you know, I've talked about, you know, sort of unnatural name change, you know, house names being replaced with another name in a different language. But that hadn't happened here. You know, the same families were farming in those farms as had been farming in 1841. You know, they were still native Welsh speakers. There hadn't been a language shift in the area. And yet 1 in 3 of the names had changed, because, you know, field names are quite ephemeral. You know, if you divide a field into 2, well, then you need 2 names, don't you? Conversely, if you amalgamate, say, 4 fields into 1 big one, well, then you get rid of the names of the 4 small fields and you call the big one something new. So they do change quite a lot, which is what makes this absolutely extraordinary. I got hold of a very early map from 1629 of Powys Castle and its domain, and and it had all the field names marked. And I thought, oh, that's fantastic. And so, you know, it was quite easy to work out which one was there, because the boundaries are still largely the same. And as I went through, I realized that most of the names were almost unchanged. You know, if you think Maes y Palmant in 1841, and in 1629 it's Mas y Palmant. You know, Kai Britain, Perth y Daon. Here Tina Don, what's here Tir a Dom rather than Don. And then Calcott's Meadow in 1629 is Barfa Calcott, which is Calcott's, well, grazing meadow, basically. You know, those names had survived 200 years. And one of the things that we're looking to do in the very near future is we've been in contact with rural payments to get access to the place names collected as part of the single farm payment scheme. Because when you fill in your single farm payments, you know, there's a space for, you know, the code for the individual field, and there's a space to write the name. And a lot of people do. So what we're hoping is that we'll essentially have a second tithe when we get these names in. Here we're predicting that we should get about 200,000 new names off this, which, I mean, obviously for one thing will take us perilously close to 1 million place names in the list. But also, in some places, we'll be able to see, have field names survived for 400 years? Because the fields around Powys Castle are not the only places where we found 16th century field names surviving to the tithe. So my wife's from a village in Flintshire, and I was up there doing a sort of place names event, and a farmer came up and said, "Oh, I've got a list of names of my fields from the 1620s, you know, would you like it?" I said, "Yeah, fantastic." And, you know, I found the farm on the map, and I thought, I wonder if any of the names are the same. And I was able to locate every single field from the list he gave me, because they were still all there in 1841. So when we get this in, we'll be able to see, you know, are they still there in 2023, which will be absolutely amazing. Now, to take us right back to the beginning, you know, we've talked a lot about losing house names, how important this is, and, you know, is this happening as much as we think it is? Is it actually happening more that English language names are being replaced by Welsh names? But, you know, it's very hard to get this information. You know, it's not always recorded by the local authorities. But of course, the Royal Mail absolutely needs to know the address of every single house in the country. So this is address-based premium. This is the database that Royal Mail and Ordnance Survey use. And what it contains is every single address and every single change of address all across Wales and England for the past 20 years, which obviously takes us basically back to the start of devolution. And, you know, I can't really do anything about things that happened pre-devolution, unfortunately. And we've received this data, and it's absolutely huge, as you can imagine. But what we're going to do is we're going to hive off the Welsh section of it, because, you know, we don't need to use the English stuff. And then we're going to go through and remove all the things that are just, you know, number 1 Penarth Street, and just keep the names. And then, of course, we'll be able to track every single name change. So we'll be able to say precisely how many names have changed and where, and have they changed from English to Welsh or from Welsh to English. And once that's done, we will actually be able to definitively be able to say, look, this is the problem, this is the scale of the problem, this is where the problem's occurring. And as a result, we will finally be able to actually do something about it. You know, in the cooperation agreement between the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, it was agreed that they would do something about place names, and this will allow us to have an evidence basis for prospective legislation. So just to conclude, this database, it's freely available, it is all open access, please use it, you know, please tell all your friends, you know, make of it what you will. And if you have any names yourselves, if you've got, you know, an old map somewhere in the attic, or, you know, you look at the thing and you find that the names that you use for your fields today are different from the names we've got from 1841, please write in and tell me. Conversely, if you realise that the names are exactly the same as they were in 1841, please write in and tell me. Because this is, because the list is statutory, it's going to be here forever. Welsh Government is legally obliged to continue funding this. And this is how we protect Wales's place name heritage for generations to come. Diolch yn fawr iawn. These are all the links you need. Enwau lleoedd hanesyddol to look at it in Welsh, historic place names to look at it in English. Diolch.